Germany did not collapse in the 1960s. It didn't freeze. It didn't starve. There were no ruins, no sirens, no ration cards. And yet, something quietly vanished forever. This was a Germany that woke up early, trusted routine, and believed tomorrow would look much like today. Streets were filled with familiar faces. Shops opened at the same hour every morning. Children walked to school without supervision. Doors were left unlocked. Time moved slower, and nobody felt the need to record it. This was everyday life in 1960s Germany. Ordinary, predictable, and now completely gone. If you lived through it, you remember it clearly. If you didn't, you've never truly seen it. The 1960s were not about big headlines. They were about small moments repeated every day. Morning bread from the local bakery, newspapers folded under one arm, factory whistles marking the rhythm of the city, housewives cleaning windows that had been cleaned 100 times before, fathers leaving for work in pressed coats, mothers knowing exactly how long soup needed to simmer, children knowing exactly where they were allowed to go and where they weren't. This was a society built on order, habit, and quiet discipline. Post-war fear had faded, replaced by stability. The Wirtschaftswunder had done its job. Jobs were steady. Wages were predictable. Life felt safe. But safety came with simplicity. There were no smartphones, no endless entertainment, no instant communication. If someone was late, you waited. If a shop was closed, you came back tomorrow. If something broke, it was repaired, not replaced. Evenings were spent together. Families gathered around small tables, radios playing softly in the background. Television existed, but it did not dominate life. One channel, black and white, programs that ended early. Silence returned afterward. Neighborhoods felt like extended families. Everyone knew who lived where. Everyone noticed when something changed. Children played outside until sunset, inventing games from nothing. No supervision, no schedules. Freedom existed because trust existed, and trust was normal. This Germany believed in progress, but not speed. Cars were smaller, roads were quieter, cities felt human. You could walk almost anywhere. Shops closed on Sundays. Time rested, people rested. Life had boundaries, and those boundaries felt comforting. Nobody spoke about nostalgia then. Nobody thought this world would disappear. It felt permanent, solid, reliable. But history has a way of erasing normality without warning. The Germany of the 1960s did not end in disaster. It simply faded, slowly replaced by efficiency, technology, and distance. Looking back now, it feels like another civilization. Not because it was better, but because it was simpler. And simplicity, once lost, never truly returns. Work defined daily life in 1960s Germany, but it did not consume it. Jobs were stable, predictable, and closely tied to identity. A man was not just employed, he belonged to his workplace. Factories, workshops, offices, and railways formed the backbone of society. People often worked in the same place for decades, sometimes their entire lives. There was pride and consistency. Wages were modest but reliable. Overtime existed, but evenings were protected. When work ended, it truly ended. Families gathered again, lunchboxes were emptied, jackets were hung in the same place every day. The rhythm rarely changed. Home life followed its own quiet order. Apartments were smaller, but they were cared for meticulously. Floors were cleaned regularly. Windows were washed even when they were already clean. Everything had its place. Kitchens were functional, not decorative. Meals were simple and repeated weekly. Soup, potatoes, bread, seasonal vegetables. Meat was not an everyday expectation. Nothing was wasted. Repairs were normal. If something broke, it was fixed by hand or by a local craftsman, not replaced. Family roles were clearly defined. Fathers worked long hours but remained present. Mothers managed households with discipline and skill. Children were expected to contribute early. Helping with chores was not optional. Responsibility was learned naturally, without discussion. Evenings were predictable. Radios played softly. Later, televisions flickered in black and white. One program, one schedule. When broadcasts ended, silence returned. People talked, or they sat quietly. Both were normal. Weekends followed rules. Shops closed on Sundays. Streets slowed down. Families visited relatives, walked through parks, or stayed home together. There was no pressure to fill time with activity. Boredom existed, and it was accepted. Children invented games. Adults rested. Time was allowed to pass without guilt. Communities were tightly woven. Neighbors knew each other's habits, not through curiosity, but through repetition. A missed routine was noticed. Illness, travel, or trouble rarely went unseen. Privacy existed, but isolation was rare. Help was practical, not emotional. A meal left at the door. A favor repaid quietly. Conversations were short but reliable. This Germany valued structure over expression. Feelings were rarely discussed openly. Stability mattered more than self-discovery. Progress was welcomed, but cautiously. New appliances arrived slowly. Cars became more common, but walking remained normal. Cities grew, yet retained a human scale. There was confidence in the future, but little urgency. People believed that life would continue much as it always had. No one imagined how quickly the world would accelerate. No one thought routine could vanish. The 1960s felt solid, safe, ordinary, and that ordinariness, unnoticed at the time, was what made it fragile. The streets of 1960s Germany were not loud, but they were alive. Cars existed, but they did not dominate. Children crossed roads without fear. Bicycles leaned against walls. Trams moved slowly through neighborhoods where people recognized one another. City centers were practical, not designed for spectacle. Small shops lined the streets. Bakeries, butcher shops, tailors, cobblers, bookstores. Most were family-owned, passed down through generations. Shopkeepers knew their customers by name. Credit was informal. Trust replaced paperwork. A nod was enough. Markets were weekly rituals. People carried baskets, not bags. Produce followed the seasons. Nothing arrived from far away. Oranges felt special. Strawberries meant summer had arrived. Life was shaped by nature more than schedules. Childhood unfolded mostly outdoors. Children spent hours outside, unsupervised, trusted to return home by instinct rather than clocks. Streets were playgrounds. Sidewalks became racetracks. Empty lots turned into imaginary worlds. There were no organized activities filling every hour. Imagination replaced structure. Arguments happened, but they ended quickly. Children learned to negotiate, to lose, to wait. Independence came early. Parents expected it. School existed, but it did not define identity. Teachers were respected, sometimes feared. Discipline was firm, unquestioned. Education focused on basics. Memorization mattered. Authority was rarely challenged. After school, children disappeared again into neighborhoods until evening. Social life for adults followed similar patterns. Cafes were modest. Conversation mattered more than atmosphere. Beer halls and local pubs served as community centers, not escapes. People drank slowly, talked quietly, and returned home early. Entertainment was limited and therefore shared. A popular radio show became a topic of discussion the next day. Television programs brought entire neighborhoods into the same moment at the same time. There was no choice, and that created connection. Fashion changed, but slowly. Clothing was durable, repaired, worn repeatedly. Trends arrived years later than elsewhere. Individuality existed, but subtle. Standing out was not encouraged. Belonging mattered more. Music began to shift the atmosphere toward the end of the decade. New sounds arrived, bringing curiosity and mild concern. Older generations watched carefully. Change was tolerated, but not rushed. Youth culture emerged cautiously, still restrained by tradition. Public behavior remained controlled. Noise was minimal. Rules were followed because they had always been followed. There was comfort in knowing what was expected. The idea of constant self-expression had not yet arrived. Life felt shared, not performed. No one documented moments. Photos were rare, deliberate. Memories lived in people, not devices. Looking back, it is easy to romanticize this world. It was not perfect. Roles were rigid. Voices were limited. Freedom had boundaries. But within those boundaries, there was clarity. People knew who they were and where they belonged. The streets, the routines, the shared rhythms created a quiet sense of stability. And it was precisely this balance that would soon be disrupted, because the world was about to speed up. And when it did, this version of everyday life would begin to disappear. By the end of the 1960s, the world that once felt permanent began to shift quietly but irreversibly. There was no single moment when people realized it was ending. No announcement, no warning. Change arrived slowly, disguised as convenience and progress. Technology moved faster. Television expanded. Advertising grew louder. Choices increased. Life became more efficient, but also more distant. The rhythms that once structured everyday existence began to loosen. Shops stayed open longer. Streets grew busier. Cars multiplied. Cities expanded outward, stretching communities apart. Neighbors no longer knew each other's routines. Familiar faces disappeared without explanation. Children spent less time outside. Supervision increased. Freedom narrowed in the name of safety. Time accelerated. Where evenings had once been quiet and shared, they became fragmented. Radios were replaced by multiple channels. Silence became uncomfortable. The idea of being constantly occupied took hold. Work changed as well. Loyalty to a single employer faded. Careers replaced jobs. Mobility replaced stability. Identity shifted from belonging to choosing. Families grew smaller. Generations moved apart. Traditions softened, then disappeared. None of this felt dramatic in the moment. It felt natural, logical, necessary, but something subtle was lost along the way. The sense of collective pace, the acceptance of repetition, the comfort of predictability. The Germany of the 1960s did not vanish because it failed. It vanished because the world demanded more speed, more choice, more noise. Looking back now, it feels like a closed chapter, not because it was perfect, but because it was coherent. Life had edges, time had weight. People were not constantly connected, yet they were rarely alone. Memory was shared, not stored. Today, images of that era feel distant and strangely calm. Streets without urgency, faces without distraction, moments without performance. It is tempting to romanticize it, but nostalgia is not the point. Understanding is. Every generation believes its normal will last forever. It never does. The everyday life of the 1960s Germany reminds us that what feels ordinary now will one day feel unreachable. Not because it was better, but because it belonged to a slower world. A world that trusted routine, accepted limits, and did not demand constant reinvention. This video is not about longing for the past. It is about recognizing how quietly history moves through daily life, how entire ways of living can disappear without being mourned. The Germany that once was still exists only in memory, photographs, and habits carried unconsciously by those who lived through it. And perhaps that is the lesson, that progress always costs something, that speed reshapes meaning, and that one day our own everyday lives will feel just as distant, just as strange, and just as gone.